An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Let me start with a quick mental exercise. Close your eyes for a second and imagine a map of the United States, but not just any version. Picture it exactly as it looked the moment America won independence from Britain in 1783. What do you see? I'm betting you're picturing something that spreads from sea to shining sea, right? From the beaches of California all the way to New York Harbor. That's what most of us conjure up, and honestly, who can blame us? That iconic shape is burned into our collective memory. But here's where it gets interesting. The country that actually won its independence? It was just 13 scrappy colonies clinging to the Atlantic coastline. All that other land stretching westward that you're imagining? It wasn't sitting there empty, waiting to be claimed like some cosmic prize. It was already home to hundreds of flourishing, complex, ancient nations. The fact that we automatically picture the finished product, this massive coast-to-coast nation, tells us something fascinating about the story we've absorbed without even realizing it. It's the manifest destiny narrative, this idea that America was destined to span the continent, as natural and unstoppable as the tide. Today, we're diving into a book that takes a sledgehammer to that comfortable narrative. It's called An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. And trust me, this isn't your typical dry history textbook. This book completely rewrites the origin story of America from the ground up. It was a finalist for the National Book Award, and once you hear what's in it, you'll understand why it stirred up such a reaction. The author, Dunbar-Ortiz, brings some serious credentials to the table. She's got a PhD in history, sure, but what really matters is that she spent decades as an activist working alongside indigenous movements. She also carries indigenous heritage herself, though she talks about it with real humility, fully aware of the complicated and often heartbreaking history woven through her own family tree. This book represents a lifetime of work, a lifetime spent pushing back against the sanitized narratives we're all fed, and actually listening to the voices that have been deliberately silenced. Here's what I can promise you. By the time we're done today, you'll never look at American history the same way again. You'll see beyond the simple tale of freedom and progress, to recognize a pattern of conquest, colonization, and violence that started long before 1776 and still shapes our world today. This isn't just some academic exercise about dusty old events. This is about understanding the actual foundation of the country and, in the process, understanding ourselves just a little bit better. Ready? Let's jump in. If we're going to truly understand the story of the United States, we can't start with the Declaration of Independence in 1776, or even with Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492. We need to rewind the clock much, much further, back to a time when the Americas weren't a new world at all, but rather an ancient one. For thousands of years before the first European ships appeared on the horizon, the continents we now call North and South America were humming with life and civilization. This wasn't some vast, untouched wilderness dotted with a few wandering tribes. We're talking about a complex network of villages, towns, and even massive cities. Take Cahokia, for instance, located near modern-day St. Louis. At its peak, it was bigger than London, complete with enormous earthen pyramids and a sophisticated social structure that would put many European cities of the time to shame. From the intricate irrigation systems built by the Hohokam people in the desert Southwest, which were genuine engineering marvels, to the Democratic Confederation of the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois in the Northeast, whose constitution would later influence none other than Benjamin Franklin, this land was already home to tens of millions of people. The foundation of these civilizations was built on something sacred, corn. The domestication of corn in central Mexico, about 10,000 years ago, was a revolutionary agricultural achievement that spread across both continents, providing the foundation for societies to thrive. Combined with beans and squash, the famous Three Sisters, these crops created a complete, balanced diet. These weren't nomadic hunters barely scraping by. The vast majority were farmers living in permanent, established communities. They managed the land with remarkable sophistication, using controlled burns to create expansive park-like forests and grasslands that served as game preserves, attracting huge herds of bison and deer. They constructed thousands of miles of roads, establishing trade networks that stretched from the Andes Mountains all the way to the Great Lakes. Archaeologists have found turquoise from the southwest in sites as far away as Wisconsin and Ontario. This was a connected, dynamic, deeply humanized world. So if this world was so advanced and developed, why have we all been taught to imagine it as a quote 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 at and full of savages. This is where the book introduces a game-changing concept, the quote 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 of conquest. Dunbar-Ortiz makes the case that the mindset Europe brought to the Americas wasn't something they invented on the spot. It had been forged and refined over centuries of internal violence and colonization. The Crusades against Muslims in the Middle East and Spain weren't just holy wars fought for God and glory. They were profit ventures, land grabs, creating a militaristic form of Christianity that promised wealth and property to anyone willing to conquer in the name of the faith. This violent ideology was also practiced closer to home. Throughout Europe, the commons, which were shared lands that peasants depended on for survival, were privatized and enclosed by wealthy elites. This created a massive population of landless, desperate people, looking for any opportunity to start over. Meanwhile, England was honing its colonial tactics even closer to home. In Ireland, they labeled the Irish as savages, seized their lands, and paid bounties for their heads. It was a brutal rehearsal that would be replayed, almost beat for beat, in America against indigenous peoples. This history matters because it shows us that the Europeans who arrived in the Americas didn't show up with blank slates. They came with a well-worn playbook. They viewed land not as a living entity to be honored and cared for, but as private property to be owned and exploited for profit. And they saw people who looked or lived differently, not as fellow human beings, but as obstacles that needed to be removed. This mindset got official legal and religious backing through something called the doctrine of discovery. Back in the 15th century, the Pope issued a series of decrees, known as papal bulls, that essentially gave Christian monarchies the divine right to claim any non-Christian lands they quote, quote, discovered. The people already living there, according to the Church's logic, had no legitimate claim to their own homeland. This doctrine, bizarre as it sounds today, became the bedrock of international law for centuries. And shockingly, it was formally adopted into United States law by the Supreme Court in the 1823 case Johnson v. McIntosh. Even more shockingly, it remains a legal precedent to this very day, continuing to undermine indigenous sovereignty. This brings us to another crucial theme running through the book. The United States was founded as and remains a settler colonial state. Now, this is different from other types of colonialism. In traditional colonialism, the colonizer exploits the labor of the native population to extract resources. Think of British rule in India or Belgian control of the Congo. But in settler colonialism, The primary goal isn't exploiting native labor, it's the land itself. And to get the land, the indigenous population must be eliminated, not just exploited or pushed aside, but actively removed, erased, and replaced by settlers. As Dunbar-Ortiz puts it so starkly, land is life, or at least, land is necessary for life. Therefore, settler colonialism is inherently genocidal in its logic. The official origin story of the United States tries desperately to hide this uncomfortable truth. It paints the Founding Fathers as heroic rebels standing up to an oppressive empire. But Dunbar-Ortiz argues that the American Revolution was, in large part, a rebellion by settlers who wanted freedom from British restrictions on their ability to seize indigenous land. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued by the British Crown, had forbidden settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, designating it as Indian Territory. This absolutely infuriated land speculators like George Washington and countless settlers who saw the entire continent as their God-given inheritance. The War for Independence, viewed through this lens, was really a war to secure the freedom to expand westward without limits. The new nation needed military force to achieve this expansion, but it didn't rely solely on a professional standing army. It perfected a brutal form of warfare that military historian John Grenier calls the first way of war. This wasn't about conventional battles between uniformed armies meeting on open fields. This was irregular warfare, counterinsurgency tactics, waged by settler militias often called rangers. Their methods were horrifyingly consistent. They deliberately targeted civilians. They didn't just fight warriors in combat. They destroyed entire villages, burned crops and food stores to the ground, and killed women, children, and elderly people. The goal wasn't simply to defeat an enemy. It was to extirpate them, to utterly destroy a people's ability to exist on their land. This is where the nightmare practice of scalp hunting became a widespread, privatized industry. Colonial governments offered cash bounties for indigenous scalps, turning murder into a profitable business for ordinary settlers. The mutilated, bloody remains they left behind gave birth to a new, chilling term, redskins. This extreme systematic violence, Dunbar-Ortiz argues, wasn't just a byproduct of existing racism. It was actually the engine that created a fierce, race-based hatred. By making the killing of indigenous men, women, and children a defining element of settler identity, generations of white Americans forged a shared bond through collective violence. The founding of the United States didn't end this way of war, it nationalized it, gave it official sanction. The Second Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees the right of the people to keep and bear arms, wasn't just about individual self-defense or hunting deer. It enshrined the power of these settler militias, which were explicitly seen as necessary for the, quote, security of a free state, meaning a state built on the constant, violent expansion into indigenous territories. No historical figure embodies this reality more than Andrew Jackson. In most traditional history books, he's presented as the hero of the common man, the father of American democracy, the people's president. But in this book, he's revealed as the architect of what Dunbar-Ortiz doesn't hesitate to call a final solution for indigenous peoples east of the Mississippi River. Jackson was a wealthy land speculator and slave owner from Tennessee who built his entire political and military career on killing indigenous people. He commanded the militias that waged genocidal campaigns against the Muskogee Creek Nation and the Seminoles in Florida. His military campaigns weren't battles in any honorable sense. They were outright massacres. After the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, where hundreds of Muskogee men, women, and children were slaughtered, Jackson's soldiers skinned the bodies of the dead to make souvenir bridle reins. Just let that sink in for a moment. When Jackson became president, he made Indian removal the centerpiece of his administration. He famously ignored a Supreme Court ruling that actually affirmed Cherokee sovereignty, basically saying, quote, "The court has made its decision, now let them enforce it." In 1830, he rammed the Indian Removal Act through Congress. This act authorized the forced expulsion of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee, and Seminole nations from their ancestral farmlands in the southeast to a designated Indian territory in what's now Oklahoma. The result was the Trail of Tears, one of the darkest chapters in American history. Tens of thousands of people were rounded up at gunpoint by the U.S. Army, torn from their homes, and forced to march 1,000 brutal miles during the dead of winter. They had no adequate food, no shelter, no warm clothing. Nearly half of the Cherokee people died on that journey. It was ethnic cleansing, plain and simple, designed to clear the South for the expansion of the Cotton Kingdom and the institution of slavery. And it wasn't just these 5 southern nations. Nearly every indigenous people east of the Mississippi was forcibly removed during this horrific period. While all this was happening, a powerful national mythology was being crafted to justify the horror. Writers like James Fenimore Cooper, in his wildly popular novel The Last of the Mohicans, created a seductive fantasy. In his story, the noble savage gracefully accepts his fate, recognizes that his time is over, and willingly hands the continent over to the heroic, nature-loving white frontiersman, Natty Bumppo, also known as Hawkeye. This myth allowed white Americans to see the disappearance of indigenous peoples not as the result of deliberate, violent conquest, but as a sad yet natural and inevitable part of progress. It was a story that washed the blood off the land and replaced it with a romantic tale of destiny and divine will. But the conquest was far from finished. The ideology of manifest destiny now set its sights further west, toward vast territories that belonged to another nation, Mexico. The U.S. invasion of Mexico in 1846 is often presented in textbooks as the country's first foreign war, something separate from westward expansion. But Dunbar-Ortiz makes the case that it was simply a continuation of the same continental conquest, just pointed in a slightly different direction. U.S. politicians and popular cultural figures like the poet Walt Whitman openly described Mexicans as an inferior, mixed race, barely better than Indians, who needed to be swept aside for the noble Anglo-Saxon race to fulfill its destiny. The war was brutal and one-sided, ending in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which Mexico was forced at gunpoint to cede half of its entire territory to the United States. This included all of present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and chunks of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. With this massive land grab, the United States finally achieved its geographic dream, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But again, the land wasn't empty. It was home to hundreds more indigenous nations, including the Apache, Navajo, Comanche, and the peoples of the Great Plains like the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. What followed was the final, and perhaps most infamous phase of what became known as the Indian Wars. The U.S. Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 1865, was a brief interruption in this westward expansion. In fact, while the North and South were tearing each other apart in the East, the Union government was actively encouraging the settlement of the West. In 1862, right in the middle of the war, President Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, which gave away millions of acres of indigenous land to white settlers, essentially for free. During the Civil War itself, volunteer militias in the West, having few Confederate soldiers to fight, turned their violence on indigenous communities with horrifying results. The most notorious incident was the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre. A Colorado militia, led by Colonel John Chivington, attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho camp that was flying both an American flag and a white flag of truce as signs of peace. They slaughtered over 150 people, mostly women, children, and elderly individuals. Afterward, the soldiers mutilated the bodies, taking gruesome trophies like scalps and body parts, which they displayed back in Denver to cheering crowds in saloons and theaters. After the Civil War ended, the U.S. Army, now a battle-hardened, technologically advanced fighting force, turned its full, undivided attention to the West. Generals like William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan, who had perfected the brutal strategy of, quote, total war against civilian populations in the South, now applied those same tactics to the indigenous nations of the plains. Sherman openly called for the extermination men, women, and children of the Sioux, stating it plainly in official military correspondence. A key part of their strategy was the systematic destruction of the buffalo. The great bison herds, numbering in the tens of millions, were the economic, cultural, and spiritual heart of Plains societies. Everything depended on them. The Army understood this perfectly. They encouraged and actively protected commercial hunters, who slaughtered buffalo by the millions, leaving entire prairies covered with rotting carcasses, taking only the hides and sometimes just the tongues. By the 1880s, the buffalo were nearly extinct, reduced from perhaps 60 million to less than 1,000. It was a deliberate act of ecological and economic warfare designed to starve the Plains nations into submission and dependence. Even in the face of this overwhelming mechanized violence, resistance continued with remarkable courage. Leaders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull of the Lakota Sioux led a powerful alliance that famously defeated Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, a victory that shocked the nation. In the Southwest, the Apache leader Geronimo led a small, brilliant band of guerrilla fighters that eluded thousands of U.S. Army troops for years, becoming an enduring symbol of unbreakable resistance. But the tide of history, backed by an industrializing nation with seemingly unlimited resources and a relentless military machine, was simply overwhelming. By the late 1880s, most surviving indigenous peoples were confined to reservations, which functioned as little more than concentration camps, where they were completely dependent on often inadequate government rations. Their children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to militaristic boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their own languages, practice their religions, or maintain any connection to their cultures. The motto of these schools, founded by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, was chillingly direct: kill the Indian and save the man. It was a program of deliberate cultural genocide. The final, heartbreaking punctuation mark of this era came on December 29, 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. The U.S. 7th Cavalry, Custer's old unit seeking revenge, surrounded a small, starving band of Lakota people, led by Chief Bigfoot. They were followers of the Ghost Dance, a peaceful, spiritual movement that prophesied the return of the buffalo, the disappearance of the white settlers, and the restoration of indigenous ways of life. The soldiers were in the process of disarming the Lakota men when a single shot rang out, likely fired accidentally. The cavalry immediately opened fire with rapid-fire Hotchkiss cannons, mowing down nearly 300 men, women, and children in a matter of minutes. Bodies were found frozen in the snow miles away. The soldiers involved were later awarded Congressional Medals of Honor for their actions, medals that still haven't been rescinded. The massacre at Wounded Knee is traditionally seen as the symbolic end of the Indian Wars. But the story doesn't end there. Not by a long shot. The book's final chapters offer a powerful testament to what the author calls survivance. a term coined by Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Vizenor. This isn't just passive survival. It's about active presence, the continuation of narratives and traditions, and a firm rejection of the victim role. The 20th century was a period of what Dunbar-Ortiz calls peacetime colonialism. The overt military violence was replaced by bureaucratic violence, which was often just as devastating. The Dawes Act of 1887 broke up communally held reservation lands into individual plots, with the surplus land conveniently sold off to white settlers and corporations. This single piece of legislation resulted in the loss of nearly two-thirds of the remaining indigenous land base. Federal policies swung wildly back and forth, from forced assimilation programs in the 1920s that tried to erase indigenous identity entirely, to the modest reforms of the New Deal in the 1930s under John Collier, and then to the absolutely disastrous termination policy of the 1950s, which sought to dissolve indigenous nations altogether and force their members into mainstream American society. But resistance was reborn in a powerful new form. The civil rights movement of the 1960s inspired a new generation of indigenous activists who were done asking politely for their rights. Groups like the National Indian Youth Council and the American Indian Movement, or AIM, emerged with energy and determination. They organized fish-ins to defend treaty rights in Washington state, directly confronting authorities. In 1969, a group calling themselves Indians of All Tribes occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, the former federal prison, for 19 months, capturing international attention and inspiring a wave of activism that spread like wildfire across the country. This wave of resistance reached its dramatic peak in 1973, back at the site of the original massacre, Wounded Knee. Oglala Lakota traditional people, protesting a corrupt and violent tribal government that was backed by the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, invited AIM to join them in an occupation of the small hamlet. The standoff lasted for 71 tense days, with hundreds of federal marshals, FBI agents, and even military personnel in armored vehicles surrounding the activists. There were firefights, 2 activists were killed, and 1 federal agent was paralyzed. The Siege of Wounded Knee in 1973 was a powerful act of reclaiming history, a loud declaration that indigenous peoples were not some relic of the distant past, but a living, breathing, powerful force in the present and future. This sustained activism eventually forced real changes. The disastrous termination policy was officially ended. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 began a slow, imperfect process of restoring some measure of control to indigenous governments over their own affairs. The struggle also moved into the international arena, with indigenous leaders taking their case directly to the United Nations. After literally decades of persistent work and advocacy, this culminated in 2007 with a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a landmark document that formally affirms their rights to self-determination, land, resources, and culture. The book ends by bringing the story full circle in a disturbing way, connecting the Indian Wars of the 19th century to the United States' global war on terror in the 21st century. The same military language is still used today. U.S. soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan referred to dangerous enemy territory as Indian country, a term that came straight out of the frontier wars. The same counterinsurgency tactics, targeting civilians and infrastructure to break the will of the population, are employed in these modern conflicts. The pattern, Dunbar-Ortiz argues convincingly, is unbroken. The U.S. empire, which began with the violent conquest of a continent, simply continued to expand its reach and methods across the entire globe. North America, she concludes with stark clarity, is a crime scene. The evidence is literally everywhere, hiding in plain sight. In the names of our cities and states, in the offensive mascots of sports teams, in the land acknowledgments we're only now beginning to make, and in the very ground beneath our feet. Acknowledging this history, she argues passionately, is not about wallowing in guilt or paralyzing shame. It's about accepting responsibility. It's about understanding that the society we live in today is a direct product of this violent past, and that building a different future requires a different path forward, one based on truth-telling, justice, the honoring of treaties that were signed and broken, and genuine respect for the sovereignty of the continent's original peoples. Reading an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States is not what you'd call a comfortable experience. It's deeply unsettling, it's painful. It can make you angry, sad, and honestly a bit sick to your stomach. And it's absolutely, utterly necessary. The book functions like a powerful acid, dissolving away all the comforting myths that have held the standard American story together for generations. What's left behind is something rawer, infinitely more complex, and far more honest. The most profound lesson for me, and one that I think is essential for everyone to truly grasp, is this concept of settler colonialism. We often think of colonialism as something that happened somewhere else, far away, with British officers strutting around India, or French administrators exploiting Africa. But Dunbar-Ortiz makes it crystal clear and impossible to ignore that the United States is, at its very foundation, and remains to this day, a colonial project. And it's a very specific, particularly brutal kind of colonial project, one that required the near-total elimination of the native population to succeed. Understanding this fundamentally changes everything. It completely reframes the celebrated westward expansion, not as a heroic story of brave pioneers taming a wild frontier, but as what it actually was, a century-long military invasion of occupied territory. It recasts so-called national heroes, like Andrew Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt, not as admirable leaders, but as deliberate architects of ethnic cleansing and genocide. It forces us to see that the foundations of this country rest not just on the lofty, beautiful ideals of liberty and democracy that we celebrate, but also on the brutal, bloody realities of systematic land theft and genocide. What makes this book so incredibly powerful, though, is that it also refuses to cast Indigenous peoples as simple, passive victims of history. It is, above everything else, a story of resistance and survivance. From the very beginning, indigenous nations fought back with incredible intelligence, strategic brilliance, raw courage, and astonishing resilience. They formed complex alliances across tribal lines, waged sophisticated guerrilla campaigns that frustrated vastly larger armies, and used diplomacy and legal challenges with skill. When military resistance became impossible against overwhelming force and technology, they fought to preserve their cultures, their languages, and their spiritual traditions through movements like the Ghost Dance and later the Sundance Revival. And in the modern era, they have continued the fight for their rights in federal courts, in the halls of Congress, on the streets in protest, and on the world stage at the United Nations. This is emphatically not a story of a vanished people fading into the sunset. It is the ongoing story of living nations that have refused against all odds to disappear. So what do we actually do with this difficult, uncomfortable knowledge? How do we apply it to our everyday lives? It can feel absolutely overwhelming, like the problems are too big and too old to ever address. But the first step is actually quite simple. We must start to tell the truth, both to ourselves and to others. First, we can begin to acknowledge the land we're actually on. Every single city, every town, every suburb, every highway in America is built on indigenous land that was taken, often violently, Take a moment to learn the names of the specific peoples whose ancestral territory you call home. Websites like native-land.ca can help you with this. This simple act of recognition is a surprisingly powerful way to begin peeling back the layers of historical erasure and to recognize the living history that exists right under our feet. Second, we can actively challenge the stories we're constantly told. The next time you watch a classic Western movie, or hear a politician casually invoke the idea of manifest destiny, or see a team with a native mascot, pause and ask yourself, whose story is actually being told here? Whose perspective is being centered? And maybe more importantly, whose story is being deliberately left out or distorted? By learning to see the world through the lens this book provides, we can begin the long process of decolonizing our own minds and the culture around us. Finally, and this is crucial, we must recognize that this is not just ancient history gathering dust in textbooks. Indigenous nations today are vibrant, modern, sophisticated sovereign entities. They're fighting for treaty rights, protecting the environment often more effectively than anyone else, leading resistance against pipelines and mining projects, working to revitalize languages on the brink of extinction, and addressing the deep, intergenerational wounds of historical trauma. We can support their ongoing struggles in concrete ways, amplify their voices, read the works of contemporary Indigenous authors and artists, support Indigenous-owned businesses, and most importantly, actually listen when they speak. This summary of an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz has only scratched the surface of what the book contains. A summary, after all, is just a rough map, and a map is never, ever the same as the actual territory. The real power of this book lies in the incredible details, in the personal stories that will break your heart, in the documented evidence that's impossible to refute, and in the sheer, undeniable weight of the case it presents. This summary is really just your invitation, your opening, to explore that territory for yourself. If any of the ideas we've discussed today have sparked something inside you, have made you curious or uncomfortable or genuinely angry, then I strongly urge you to pick up a copy and read it cover to cover. Reading it is not just an act of learning some history. It's an act of bearing witness to truths that have been suppressed, an experience that will fundamentally change the way you see the country you live in and your own place within its ongoing, unfinished story. You'll find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable or thought-provoking, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to Billionaire's Bookshelf. It genuinely helps us continue to bring these powerful, often challenging ideas to more people who need to hear them. By sharing this knowledge, by talking about it with friends and family, we all take one more small but important step on the long, difficult road toward real understanding, and hopefully, toward building a more just and honest future together. Let's keep learning, keep questioning, and keep growing. Thanks for listening.